I've played tons of video games, and from my interest in video gaming came the desire to learn more about the intricacies of what made our industry so epic. The history, the people, and more importantly, the lore of making a simple mistake and how that mistake can shape the future of an industry, which is exactly what Old Man Sim, a fellow YouTuber and Twitch streamer, suggested. But what mistakes happened? Was Doom supposed to be a high fantasy game? Yeah, it was, but they didn't. And that's just one example of a decision that was made that drastically changed our industry. Let's begin. The early years of arcade games always fascinated me. Prior to the arcade games we know and love now, many of which may have been in the arcades in your childhood, there were just gimmicky electromechanical games or games of skill, things you wouldn't really invest money in. It was more so just to pass the time, but that all changed once Atari entered the video game industry. Atari is one of the heavy eights, a common nickname you'll hear me apply to Atari, Konami, Data East, Namco, Sega, Nintendo, Taito, and Capcom. But out of those companies, one stood out to create what many people believe is the most influential game ever created, Space Invaders, developed by Taito. Released in 1978 in Japan, Taito's Space Invaders is a pretty low-threat fixed shooter that single-handedly ushered in the golden age of the arcades. It was designed by Tomohiro Nishikado, who was really interested in seeing how successful these games could be. Atari's breakout was interesting, but what if we replaced the paddle at the bottom with a spaceship and the ball with bullets? What if those bricks at the top were changed out to active targets, or aliens, that were descending down upon us in legions, lined up ready for us to take them out? That's what Space Invaders was all about. But where's the mistake? It's simple really. The hardware. Space Invaders was created by using an Intel 8080 CPU, a CRT monitor, and the Texas Instruments Sierra November 76477 sound chip. But in the process of development, Tomohiro Nishikado noticed that his aliens were moving incredibly slow, beyond slow, to the point where it really didn't feel like a challenge. But he pushed on, said screw it, kept shooting the enemies. And something interesting happened. As the aliens disappeared one by one, the game sped up. And by the time only one alien was on the screen, it was a frenzy of motion. This became an undocumented feature and led to this game receiving universal acclaim. While we talked about Space Invaders having code that led to things being slow then dramatically speeding up, there is another game that did it first. If we go back to the earliest years of gaming, many of you should remember Pong. Pong was Atari's first breakthrough game and one of the first commercially successful video games. It was created by Alan Alcorn on request from Nolan Bushnell, who was inspired by the Magnavox Odyssey, so much so that in many ways it was an idea ripped straight from the mind of Ralph Baer, and Atari was torn to shreds because of it. That lawsuit hit the first generation of gaming hard. Tons of companies were in the crosshair. Alan Alcorn himself was not experienced in creating games, and to be honest, you would have been hard-pressed to find anyone who was. This was 100% unequivocally uncharted territory in video gaming history, so the concept of Pong for the most part was just a practice exercise for Alan Alcorn to program games. It was simple, take the idea from Magnavox but do it better, and in a more commercially viable way. We have two paddles and a ball. One paddle serves, we knock it back, and there's a score counter at the top of the screen. Ipso facto, holy shit, there's a game. But Alcorn noticed one critical defect. As the ball hit the paddle, it would speed up. When one of the players missed, the speed reset. Also, the paddles, they didn't touch the top of the screen. Well, I guess we don't want people playing forever, so let's keep that in as well. With all of these tiny little considerations, a legendary game was created, one that drove the entirety of the first generation of home consoles. If you're curious about this era of gaming history, I do suggest you check out my Generations episode all about it. We talk about the commercially successful consoles, their history, and their relevance in the landscape of gaming at the time. It's a good watch. And for anybody who doesn't know, the Ready Go Gaming Show is not a podcast, it is a documentary, so feel free to put it on in the background while you're driving, or just want to watch something long. I know it's few and far between for many people because y'all do enjoy my short form content more, but I do enjoy making the longer stuff every now and then. Developers are people just like me and you. The only difference is they make video games and I'm here talking about them. I don't envy developers. They work with incredible deadlines, a pressure that would make most people quit the same day, and in some ways it's an incredibly thankless job. The only way we know who made games way back when was due to the credits section. And in the case of Japanese developers, they were not permitted to put their names in the game as a corporate policy. They didn't want their guys poached by other companies. At the same time, if you're working for someone like Konami in the 80s and 90s, there's a good chance you'll be responsible for porting their arcade games, and those games are hard as fuck. They always were. And that's where Kazuhisa Hashimoto found himself while he was porting Gradius to the NES. If you've ever played Gradius, you'll know it's hard, and part of the development process is beating a game. You have to see the length of it. Unless you're Ubisoft or EA and you can just offload your bullshit, but that's a conversation for another day. Due to this, Kazuhisa-san decided to put in a cheat code to tilt the odds in his favor. The code goes as follows: up, up, down, down, left, right, B, A. And that code is one that lives in infamy. Him forgetting to remove the code and then discovering it prior to Gradius being shipped gave developers an ultimatum: remove the code and potentially cause bugs or glitches, or just leave it in. The sequence itself was so easy to remember, and from that point on, the code embedded itself in the culture. It's always worth using the Konami Code in Konami games to see just what happens. Sometimes it bled into other things. For example, if you own an Alexa, try speaking out the code and see what happens. When we think of strong franchises in the RPG world, you would likely think of Ultima and Wizardry, because when they came out, they were, for all intents and purposes, the OGs, the great-grandfathers of the modern traditional role-playing game. But as time went on, we were exposed to other great systems, the Dungeons & Dragons rule sets, the invasion of the Japanese role-playing game, and niche themes that could really work if the developers cared enough to keep it going, to offer continuity. And Interplay did that with Fallout 1 and 2 in 1997 and 1998 respectively. But Interplay is one of those companies that made a lot of mistakes. Hell, in 1998 they avoided bankruptcy by going public, and that period of turmoil lasted for a long time. No matter what they did, they found themselves passed around like a joint, from Virgin Interactive to Titus, and all of their games seemed to be published by other people. Interplay was so concerned about remaining on the home computer market that they rarely released games on the home consoles, and by the time they wanted to, it was a little too late. Instead of making Fallout 3, they wanted to create a top-down shooter, originally on the PS1, which was abandoned. Then on the PS2, which they did, and also abandoned. Instead, they focused on Brotherhood of Steel, a game that really didn't do Fallout justice in the slightest, and their lack of interest in making that third entry allowed for Bethesda to come in with their market overtake and release Fallout 3 as their own product, effectively saving one of the biggest cult classic RPG franchises of the 90s. Now, I don't like Bethesda. In fact, I think they're exceptionally hit or miss, but hey, a legacy franchise survived, and that means the world to me. And had Fallout 3 been created by Interplay in the way that it was originally designed, I doubt that we would have seen another Fallout entry. You like coffee? I like coffee. When I was a kid, I couldn't drink coffee. I felt it would stunt my growth. You know what else I didn't play? Grand Theft Auto, because my dad was big into not letting me play any games that were violent or rated teen unless it was Star Wars. So shout out to Star Wars Bounty Hunter and Star Wars Demolition for satiating my unwarranted sociopathic tendencies. You're the real MVP. But when I was like 15, I finally sat down with my dad and I said, hey, look, I'm not gonna do anything in the game. I'm not crazy, I have common sense, and I'd really like to play Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. I'll even do better at my chores. I'll study more. And he said, whatever. To this day, I still hold San Andreas in tremendous regard for being a genuinely fun game, but it wasn't soon after I bought it that the modding community discovered the infamous hot coffee mod. What is that? Well, it's a mini game where you could bump uglies with your girlfriend, and by bump uglies, I mean dry humping with extra emotion, right? There's nothing that would make me hot and bothered. It's like taking a Barbie and Ken doll and smashing their groins together. But that mistake to not remove the code from the game sent ripples through the ESRB, who had to look inside their own policies and practices to fix their review process. I don't know if it was to save face, but I like to believe that as a parent, the governing board of a video game review system is reliable. And in the case of GTA San Andreas, it wasn't. And should any company in the future fail to disclose the context of their games, be it violence, sexual activity, nudity, etc., they're looking at a $1 million fine. It even led to the Truth in Video Game Rating Act, requiring the ESRB to access all of the content in a game before issuing a rating, because previously they were just going off of feedback and demos. That's an important change. love Street Fighter. There's a chance we might talk about Street Fighter later in this episode, but one thing that's always frustrated me and in some ways still sits sour with me was an issue concerning DLC for Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Now, I wasn't a Tekken fan. I did dabble with it occasionally in the arcades. I think maybe I played Tekken Tag Tournament like 3 times as a kid before I realized Street Fighter's like way better. And I remember being stationed at Eglin Air Force Base when Capcom announced that they were making a crossover with Namco, where 2 universes I never thought would intertwine would collide for the ultimate fighting game. One of the series that I adored growing up in the arcades was Marvel vs. Capcom, so to some capacity I expected that. I played it, and I hated it. But there was something more devious going on. In the game, there were 38 playable characters, and Capcom announced even more characters as time went on. But the characters were already on the disc that I paid $60 for. Why would I pay for more characters for a game I bought? And their excuse was, well, is to increase compatibility between players who do and do not choose to download characters when they arrive as a DLC. And it'll help so we don't have to make a super version. Oh, fuck you. This opened up a lot of eyes in understanding the value of DLC and how it impacts our gameplay experience. There have been 2 major crashes in the video game industry. The first isn't talked about that often, the crash of 1977. The origins of this are all attributed to the success of Pong, specifically home Pong, because the first generation of gaming was one big old massive Pong orgy. Over 995 Pong clones have been discovered to date, and that list is constantly updated. Every single comprehensible person who wanted to break into the industry in the 70s did so by flooding the market with Pong consoles that had a life of roughly 6 months of economic effectiveness until the next big same idea came out. That happened until Fairchild released the Channel F, which was the first home programmable video game console, a power move that put Atari at a disadvantage, which they weren't too keen on at all. Enter the second generation of gaming with the Atari 2600, where many of the companies that made mistakes in the first generation repeated them in the second generation, and in 1983, that all culminated to a massive economic failure of the video game industry. Now, the common myth is that ET on the Atari caused it, but let's be honest, the market was saturated with shit games. There was no third-party developers until Activision came into play in 1979, and once Activision proved the third-party model could work, cowabunga it was. Anyone and everyone could make a game, pay a fee, and have it on the Atari 2600. The market rose quickly and then it crashed hard. It destroyed tons of companies. Again, there is a Ready Go Gaming Show Generations episode about this, and I do suggest you check it out as well. That freedom of developers and publishers to create and release whatever they wanted on home consoles was a wake-up call. This was not the 70s anymore. People wanted to trust the company. They wanted their brand to deliver, and that's where Nintendo stepped up in the mid-80s to establish quality control standards, something that remains to this day. Video game consoles were expensive. They were an investment. You knew that when you bought a video game console, it was a principal down payment that would require you to consistently buy more software to build your library. The NES originally listed at $199 in 1985. In today's economy, that's $564. The Sega Genesis in 1989 sold for $189, $477 by today's standards. These game systems were not something that you would just go to a game store and pick up off the shelf. They were cultural choices. You were committed to that damn console. They were considered luxury items for households, something the entire family could enjoy at any given time. There was no understanding of obsolescence. It was a frenzy buy to stand out among your peers, even if you were an adult. That's the economic importance of video gaming. But the price does not always equate to quality. This was evident by the 3DO, which launched for $699 in 1993. With modern inflation, that equals $1,510. Holy fucking yikes! What about the Neo Geo AVS, that unicorn of a system that allowed the upper echelon to bring the arcade home? $649 or $1,552 by modern inflation. But what about the Philips CDI, the future of gaming? That bad boy cost around $1,000. $2,237 for one of the most shit consoles you could ever imagine. The only thing that might have been somewhat beneficial was the fact that it could play every CD you could imagine, but the transition from home entertainment system to straight up video game console was not enough to justify keeping it on the market. Consumers started to realize that price did not equal quality, and in turn, folks began actually paying attention to the reviews and opinions of folks who mattered in the industry. And as such, companies adapted to bring more rational price points to their consoles, and they were ready to adjust those prices as necessary to make sure people could enjoy their products. Sega was Nintendo's primary competitor for a while. In the 8-bit era, they struggled to compete with them, but when the 16-bit era came out, you had the Genesis kids and you had the Nintendo kids, and let me tell you, if you remember those television spots, that was a time to be alive. Nintendo talks shit about Sega, Sega talks shit about Nintendo. The quote that comes to mind, and feel free to recite this with me. You ready? Here we go. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. That's ballsy as hell. The Genesis was the one console that stood toe-to-toe with Nintendo. Nobody else to date had done that. The two companies were constantly at war trying to nail exclusivity rights for developers. They wanted brand loyalty. It was 100% a console war, and as consumers, we ate it up. But I feel Sega misread the room. There's instances in gaming history where it didn't pay to be the innovator, and in some ways that still occurs. Being the creator of an idea can be rough, because someone else can take the baseline foundation of that idea, flip it, and make it better. Look at Phasmophobia. It was a hit before other ideas came and fixed its issues. Battle Royale games are the same. PUBG was great, but Fortnite really pulled in folks. Returning to the 16-bit era, we saw a divergence. When it came to moving past the 4th generation of gaming, Nintendo wanted to create a disc-based system, and that disc-based system would have happened for the Super Nintendo. It was going to be known as the Nintendo PlayStation. But instead of going that route, they decided to trust Philips, and we all know how that went. That resulted in creating a competitor moving forward. Instead, Nintendo decided to do another cartridge-based release for the next generation, the Nintendo 64. Sega, on the other hand, did hold back and put all of their chips on making the Genesis survive. They wanted backwards compatibility for the Master System, but the Master System wasn't popular in the US. So the power-based converter was really only for a niche audience. They wanted to use this fancy new frisbee called the compact disc, but the library for it was tiny. And finally, in one last-ditch effort, they added a 32-bit era answer as a knee-jerk reaction to Atari's Jaguar, the 32X. But when they announced the 32X, they also announced the Saturn, believing it to be a transitional device for consumers to enjoy. The problem is, nobody did. These business decisions ultimately painted the wall with a mural that could only be described as a slow fall from grace, from a company that did so much during the 4th generation. It's a shame too. I miss Sega. Survival horror games are interesting to me because they require a level of ambiance and atmosphere that other genres can easily skate by without having, by having quality storyline or mechanics. In fact, some of my favorite games as a kid were simple in the sense that I knew I was controlling someone in an environment, like Link in Ocarina of Time or Mario in Super Mario 64. But to me, those games were just people in a world that we needed to save. Survival horror, it feels personal. Horror is a unique thing. In America, we were driven to scare people with monsters and slashers and things that diddle our buttholes in the middle of the night. But in Japan, they enjoy the monster in your head, psychological horror. It's massive, and in the 90s, Resident Evil and Silent Hill captured that atmospheric requirement excellently. We felt the pressure of running out of ammunition when we knew that there was some monstrosity around the corner ready to ruin our day. We were running around areas we should know because we've been there thousands of times, but the pressure of escaping makes us forget. There are puzzles, moments of respite when it's time to save. It's hard to truly describe the impact that those two franchises had, but there's one thing in particular that made Silent Hill stand out: the fog. The fog that surrounds the town of Silent Hill on the PS1 was the result of graphical limitations. We talked about this in a previous episode that covered worst blockbuster rentals. The topic was Superman 64, which has this bullshit kryptonite fog that quite literally exists as a shitty draw distance mask, and it is. The PS1 suffered from the same thing, but to me, the lack of graphical capabilities worked wonders for Silent Hill. The fog created a sense of claustrophobia. I wasn't going to get out of this nightmare on my own free will. I had to seek a resolution, and that fog stuck. Sure, Silent Hill has been neglected through the years, but that effect of using the limitations for a positive, supplemented by a believable experience, set a standard, and I'm not afraid to say that. Fighting games are fun. I love them, my kids love them, and in my childhood, there were a handful of arcade games that I preferred over those stupid novelty ticket games, light gun shooters, and fighting games. Growing up, we were a Mortal Kombat house. My dad was just really big into the realism that they offered, or at least he perceived it offering. But my cousin had Street Fighter 2, and that was the game that really intrigued me. Obviously, Capcom has used Ryu as a pseudo-face of the company for years, but what made Street Fighter 2 the golden standard of tournament fighters was ultimately a mistake. The producer of Street Fighter 2, Noritaka Funamitsu, worked alongside Akira Nishitani and Akira Yasuda. Nishitani was in charge of game design, while Yasuda was in charge of making the characters, and between all three of them, the concept of balance really wasn't a priority. He wanted a game with animations that kicked ass, with environments that made sense. And much like the first game, he wanted some bonus stages to kind of cut the fat, if that makes sense. In Street Fighter 1, the first game, which we all love to ignore because it's a fucking dreadful time, there were 4 bonus stages, all of which involve breaking planks. Think of it as the Street Fighter version of Test Your Might. But in Street Fighter 2, the most famous bonus stage involves us beating the shit out of a car, and that's where something interesting happened. In an interview, Funamitsu said the following: "While I was making a bug check during the car bonus stage, I noticed something strange. Curious. I taped the sequence and we saw that during punch timing, it was possible to add a second hit, and so I thought this was something impossible to make useful inside a game, as the timing balance was hard to catch. So we decided to leave the feature as a hidden one. The most interesting thing is that this became the base for future titles. Later, we were able to make the timing more comfortable and the combo into a real feature. In the game, we thought if you got the perfect timing, you could place several hits, up to 4 I think. Then we managed to place 8. A bug? Maybe." The influence was recognized by the producer himself, so I let him do the talking for me. It's a massively important thing that happened by chance, and since then it's been a standard. Killer Instinct even relied on it, and that's awesome to me. And those are 10 of the most important gaming mistakes in video gaming history, at least to me. What'd you think of this list? Is there anything that you would love to add? If so, feel free to do so down below. If you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home in our community. We're a group of retro gaming enthusiasts that love remembering a time when life was just a little bit easier to live, and if you vibe with that, feel free to join us. We are actively approaching a major milestone of 8,000 subscribers, and if we accomplish that, I'll make a video of the community's choice. Finally, the single most important thing you could do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of the videos and the projects that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes. Fortefyre out.